Zimbabwe is a country rich in history, culture and resilience. Before colonial rule, the land was home to powerful African kingdoms, thriving trade networks and remarkable stone structures, achievements such as Great Zimbabwe. However, during the late 19th century, European colonial expansion dramatically changed the lives of the people of Zimbabwe. This documentary explores the history of Zimbabwe, colonization, the impact of colonial rule, the resistance of African communities, and the struggle that eventually led to independence. Long before European settlers arrived, Zimbabwe was inhabited by the Shona and Ndebele peoples. The most famous civilization was the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, which flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries. Great Zimbabwe was one of Africa's greatest cities, built entirely from stone without mortar. The kingdom controlled trade in gold, ivory, and other valuable resources. Arab and Portuguese traders traveled to the region seeking wealth, particularly gold. The prosperity of Great Zimbabwe demonstrated that sophisticated African civilizations existed long before European colonization. During the late 18th, European nations were competing to control African territories in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. One of the key figures interested in Zimbabwe was Cecil John Rhodes, a British businessman and mining magnate. Rhodes dreamed of expanding British influence across Africa. Through his company, the British South Africa Company, he sought control of territories rich in minerals and agricultural land. In 1888, Rhodes obtained the controversial right concession from King Lobengula. Many historians believe that Lobengula did not fully understand the extent of the agreement, which granted mining rights to Rhodes' representatives. This agreement paved the way for British occupation. In 1890, a group known as the Pioneer Column entered the territory under the protection of armed forces. They established Fort Salisbury, today known as Harare. The British South Africa Company gradually expanded its control over the region. The territory became known as Southern Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. European settlers began taking fertile land while African communities were pushed onto less productive areas. Traditional systems of governance were weakened as colonial authorities imposed new laws and administrative structures. Colonial rule was not accepted without resistance. In 1896 and 1897, the Shona and Ndebele peoples launched a major uprising against colonial rule known as the First Chimurenga. Spiritual leaders played a significant role in mobilizing resistance. African fighters attacked colonial settlements and challenged the authority of the British South Africa Company. However, the uprising was eventually suppressed by superior colonial weaponry and military organization. Thousands of Africans lost their lives, but the first Chimurenga became a symbol of resistance and national pride. The first Chimurenga was the first major armed struggle by the indigenous people of Zimbabwe against colonial occupation by the British South Africa Company. The word Chimurenga comes from the Shona language and means revolutionary struggle or a war of liberation. Land theft. After the arrival of settlers in 1890, large areas of fertile land were seized. The Shona and Ndebele people had lived on this land for generations. Colonial authorities claimed ownership and gave much of it to white settlers. Many Africans were forced to move from their ancestral lands. For African communities, land was more than property. It was tied to family history, livestock, farming, and spiritual beliefs. The loss of land created deep anger. Before colonization, the Ndebele kingdom was ruled by King Lobengula. In 1893, the British South Africa Company fought and defeated the Ndebele kingdom in what became known as the First Matabele War. Lobengula fled and later died. The destruction of the kingdom meant that traditional leaders lost authority and colonial administrators took control. Forced labor and taxes. Colonial authorities introduced taxes, Africans who had previously lived independently now had to find money to pay these taxes. Many were forced to work in mines, farms and colonial projects under difficult conditions. People felt they were becoming servants on land that had once belonged to them. The rinderpest disaster. In 1896, a deadly cattle disease called rinderpest spread across southern Africa. Thousands of cattle died. For African families, cattle were a source of food, wealth, farming power, social status. The loss was devastating. Many Africans believed colonial authorities had either caused the disease or failed to help. This increased hostility toward colonial rule. One unique feature of the first Chimurenga was the role of spiritual leaders. Among the Ndebeles, a respected spiritual figure named Mulimo became associated with the resistance. Mulimo messages encouraged people to unite against colonial occupation. Among the Shona people, spirit mediums also inspired resistance. Many fighters believed ancestral spirits supported their struggle. This helped unite communities that had often been divided before colonization. The uprising begins March 1896. The first major attacks started in the Matabeleland region. The Ndebele warriors launched coordinated attacks on isolated farms, settlements, and colonial outposts. Settlers were caught by surprise. Many farms were abandoned. Roads became dangerous. Communication between colonial settlements broke down. The British South Africa Command suddenly found itself losing control of large areas. One of the most important events occurred around the city of Bulawayo. Thousands of Ndebele's fighters surrounded the settlement. Colonial forces and settlers barricaded themselves inside defensive positions. For months, Bulawayo remained under threat. The settlers relied heavily on rifles, machine guns, and defensive fortifications. Although the Ndebele fighters were brave and numerous, they faced a major disadvantage in weaponry. As fighting continued in Matabeleland, the Shona people in Mashonaland also rose against colonial rule. The war spread across much of present-day Zimbabwe. Unlike a single centralized army, Shona resistance was organized through a local chiefs and spirit mediums. Colonial officials, police officers, traders, and settlers became targets. Many districts became unsafe for colonial administration. For a time, the British South Africa Command feared losing the territory altogether. The British South Africa Command called for reinforcements from South Africa, Britain, other colonial territories. Well-armed troops arrived with modern rifles, Maxim machine guns, better supplies, military training. The technological gap became decisive. African fighters often relied on spears, traditional weapons, a limited number of firearms. The Maxim gun, one of the world's first machine guns, gave colonial forces overwhelming firepower. The death of Mulimo. One of the most controversial moments occurred in 1896. American scout and colonial officer Frederick Russell Burnham tracked down and killed Mulimo. Colonial authorities believed Mulimo was directing the rebellion. Whether Mulimo was a single person or represented a broader spiritual movement remains debated by historians. However, his death weakened morale among some resistance fighters. Cecil Rhodes negotiations. An unusual event happened later in the war. Instead of relying on military force, Cecil John Rhodes personally met with Ndebele leaders, the Matopo Hills. He attempted to negotiate an end of the fighting. Some Ndebele leaders agreed to stop the war after promises regarding treatment and governance. These meetings helped reduce resistance in Matabeleland. Defeat of the Shona resistance. The war continued longer in Mashonaland. Colonial forces systematically targeted chiefs, spirit mediums, resistant leaders. Colonial forces systematically targeted chiefs, spirit mediums, resistant leaders. Many leaders were captured or executed. By 1897, organized resistance had largely been defeated. Thousands of Africans had been killed. Many villages were destroyed. Colonial rule became firmly established. Although the uprising failed militarily, it became one of the most important events in Zimbabwean history. The first Chimurenga showed that Africans did not willingly accept colonial domination. The memory of the war inspired later generations. When Zimbabwe liberation movements fought against white minority rule in the 1960s and 1970s, they called their struggle the Second Chimurenga, linking it directly to the heroes of 1896 and 1897. Today, the first Chimurenga remembered as the beginning of Zimbabwe's long fight for self-determination and independence. 1890, Pioneer Column occupies Mashonaland. 1893, the Bele Kingdom defeated. March 1896, the Bele Uprising begins. June 1896, Shona Uprising spreads. 1896, Siege of Bulawayo. 1896, Mulimo killed. 1897, resistance defeated. 1980, Zimbabwe gains independence. For decades, colonial authorities implemented policies that favored white settlers. Some of the most fertile lands were reserved for European settlers. African farmers were often relocated to overcrowded reserves with the poor agricultural conditions, taxes and forced labor. Africans were required to pay taxes in cash to obtain money. Many were forced to work on farms, mines and construction projects owned by settlers. Education and opportunities. Educational opportunities were unequal. White schools received significantly more funding than African schools. Many schools, professions and political positions were reserved for Europeans. Segregation in Southern Rhodesia developed racial segregation policies that restricted where Africans could live, work and participate politically. These policies created deep economic and social inequalities. By the 1950s and 1960s, African nationalist movements began demanding majority rule. Organizations emerged to challenge colonial domination. Important leaders included Joshua Ngomo, Robert Mugabe, Ndabaningi Stole. These leaders organized political movements and campaigned for equal rights and independence. Many were arrested and imprisoned by colonial authorities. In 1965, Rhodesia's white minority government led by Ian Smith declared independence from Britain through the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This led to prolonged conflict known as the Rhodesian Bush War, also called the Second Chimurenga. Liberation movements fought against the Rhodesian government. The war lasted throughout the 1970s and resulted in significant casualties and displacement. International pressure and military stalemate eventually pushed all sides toward negotiations. After years of war, loss of life and international pressure, it became clear that neither the Rhodesian government nor the liberation movements could achieve a complete military victory. By the late 1970s, the conflict known as the Rhodesian Bush War or Second Chimurenga had reached a critical stage. Thousands had been killed, many villages had been destroyed, and the country's economy was suffering. The international community increasingly pushed for a peaceful settlement that would allow Zimbabwe's majority black population to exercise political power through democratic elections. In September 1979, representatives from the Rhodesian government, Britain and Zimbabwe nationalist movements met in London, United Kingdom. The negotiations took place at Lancaster House and became known as the Lancaster House Agreement. The main participants included Robert Mugabe, Joshua Ngomo, Ian Smith, Lord Carrington. The negotiations were difficult and often tense. Each side had different goals and deep mistrust after years of war. After months of discussions, an agreement was finally reached. The agreement established several important conditions. Ceasefire. Both sides agreed to stop fighting. liberation fighters were assembled and designated camps while arrangements were made for elections. For the first time in many years, there was hope that peace could replace war. Temporary British administration. Britain temporarily resumed responsibility for governing the country. This was intended to ensure a neutral transition to independence. The country briefly returned to British authority under Lord Solmes. His role was to supervise the ceasefire and oversee elections. The agreement guaranteed that free elections would be held. For the first time, the black majority would have the opportunity to choose a government through universal adult suffrage. A new constitution was established. The agreement included protections for minority groups and set out the framework for the future independent nation. In February 1980, Zimbabwe held its first international recognized democratic elections. Millions of people participated. Many Zimbabweans had waited generations for the chance to vote freely. Long queues formed outside polling stations across the country. People traveled great distances to cast their votes. The atmosphere was filled with excitement, hope, and uncertainty. When the results were announced, the party led by Robert Mugabe, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, won a decisive victory. The election results reflected widespread support for liberation leaders who had fought against minority rule. Robert Mugabe becomes Prime Minister. Following the election victory, Robert Mugabe became the first Prime Minister of independent Zimbabwe. Many people expected a period of revenge against former enemies. Instead, Mugabe initially delivered a message of reconciliation. In one of his most famous speeches, he encouraged Zimbabweans of all races to work together in building the new nation. His message reassured many white Zimbabweans who feared retaliation after independence. At that moment, many citizens and international observers were optimistic about Zimbabwe's future. Independence Day, 18 April 1980. The most important moment arrived on the night of 7 and 18 April 1980. Thousands gathered at what is now known as National Sports Stadium in Harare. As midnight approached, emotions ran away. Many people sang, danced, and celebrated after decades of struggle. At midnight, the Union Jack symbolizing British rule was lowered. The new Zimbabwean flag was raised. The country officially became the Independent Republic of Zimbabwe. For many Zimbabweans, it was one of the proudest moments in the nation's history. Some people cried with joy, remembering relatives who had died during the liberation struggle. Others celebrated the promise of freedom, equality, and self-government. International guests and independence. The independence ceremony attracted leaders and dignitaries from around the world. Among the most notable guests was Prince Charles, who attended on behalf of Britain. Leaders from across Africa also attended to celebrate the birth of a new independent nation. Zimbabwe independence was viewed as a major victory against colonialism and minority rule throughout Africa. The hopes of a new nation. And independent Zimbabwe inherited significant challenges: economic inequality. Most of the country's wealth and productive farmlands remained concentrated in white ownership. War damage. Years of conflict had damaged infrastructure and disrupted communities. National unity. Different ethnic and political groups needed to be united into one nation. Education and healthcare. The new government faced pressure to expand services to black majority who had been disadvantaged during colonial rule. Despite these challenges, the atmosphere in 1980 was overwhelmingly hopeful. Men believed Zimbabwe could become one of Africa's most prosperous and successful countries. Zimbabwe independence represented far more than a change of government. For millions of black Zimbabweans, it meant the end of minority rule, the right to vote, national self-determination, international recognition as a sovereign state, the fulfillment of decades of resistance stretching back to the first Chimurenga of 1896. The victory symbolized the sources of generations who had fought, sacrificed, and dreamed of freedom. As the Zimbabwean flag rose into the night sky on 18 April 1980, it carried with it hopes of a nation. After nearly 90 years of colonial domination, Zimbabwe had finally reclaimed its destiny. The road ahead would bring new triumphs and new challenges, but on that historic night, the dream of independence had become reality.